Morning, welcome. My name is Leon Potter. I'm an instructor here at the Vancouver Island Theatre Department, and I am also the director of the upcoming production of Romeo and Juliet, which I'm here to shamelessly plug. If you will notice as you come in, the dates and times, you will have a small slip of paper that's been handed out to you, which has got all the information of the upcoming production, which will be happening right here, running from November the 3rd all the way through to November the 12th. Today, however, it is my honor and my privilege to introduce a fellow lover of Shakespeare and his work. Dr. Keith Harrison has an extraordinary background in literature, 5 published novels, 3 of which have been shortlisted for literary awards, as well as short stories, nonfiction, and a variety of scholarly essays. He has taught here as well as many other places all over the place and has a very, very deep background and a love of the Shakespeare and literary arts. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you Dr. Keith Harrison.
Thank you, Leon, and let me say it's a pleasure for someone who is a bad actor to be standing on a stage again. The last time I think I did it was in high school and decided my career was in the NBA. Somehow I got sidetracked into teaching, which has been a very good second choice to being point guard for the Boston Celtics. And I'm really looking forward to the production that students will be putting on of Romeo and Juliet. Leon and everyone else makes productions alive and vibrant, and I understand this is the first time Romeo and Juliet has actually been performed at VIU, so much excitement. The paper I'm going to read today is a comparison in some ways of Shakespeare's famous play, Romeo and Juliet, and a remarkable film by Deepa Mehta, the Indo-Canadian filmmaker, who, as we're talking, is currently shooting one of the most remarkable books written, and that is Salman Rushdie's novel, Midnight's Children, for which he completed the script. So we're part of some exciting expressiveness around what it's like to be in the world. And I like the continuity between Shakespeare 400 years ago and someone like Deepa Mehta as a filmmaker in obviously a very different media, moving from stage to screen, finding ways of telling a story she wants to tell by reworking in some ways Shakespeare's play, which in turn was a reworking of earlier forms. So, Romeo and Juliet and the romantic politics of Deepa Mehta's Water. A film that stirred controversy, riots, burning, and death threats even before its much-delayed completion, Deepa Mehta's Water can be cited in many political contexts, most obviously that of religious traditionalism versus the autonomy of women. The haunting depiction of the confinement and exploitation of widows, one of them a child, raises human rights issues that are even larger than those of gender. Mehta's own body of work, especially the elemental films, Fire, 1996, Earth, 1998, and Water, 2005, which explore with broad humanism a recurring theme of intolerance, provides a fuller context within which to understand the third work in this trilogy. But the imaging of social hypocrisy and systemic cruelty in Water has elicited hostile responses that seek to resituate the politics of Mehta's film. Quote, "They come with foreign money to make a film which shows India in a poor light because that is what sells in the West," unquote. Set in 1938 during the British Raj, Water also enters into a post-colonial discourse where Shakespeare is viewed as a paramount symbol of British culture and an instrument of colonization used as a rationale for the civilizing mission of conquest in India. However, in Water, a disparaging allusion to Romeo and Juliet is, in a double paradox, a catalyst towards independence for the protagonist that is linked in turn to the larger project of national self-fulfillment. When Narayan falls in love with Kalyani, a beautiful widow from the ashram, his friend derides such romanticism by mockingly referring to Shakespeare's tragedy. Undeterred, Narayan persists in his love for Kalyani across barriers that are both physical and cultural, and akin to those separating the Montagues from the Capulets. In Romeo's words, "With love's light wings did I o'erperch these walls, for stony limits cannot hold love out. And what love can do, that dares love attempt. Therefore thy kinsmen are no stop to me." As well as an indebtedness to Shakespeare, there may be autobiographical traces in the storyline, since Deepa Mehta, born in Aripsar into a Hindu family, married a Canadian Jewish filmmaker Paul Saltzman. Echoing Shakespeare's play, the character of Kalyani takes her own life out of despair in a thwarting world that denies the possibility of love. But if her character conforms to the tragic pattern of Juliet, the Romeo figure, Narayan, does not. His romantic idealism refocuses on the charismatic and transformative figure of Gandhi, in whom Narayan finds political and psychological hope. As Anne Carson observes in her book Eros, the Bittersweet, about the condition of being in love, quote, "The difference between what is and what could be is made visible." For Narayan, again quoting Anne Carson, desire moves. Eros is a verb. The hero's personal movement towards a wider concept of love and his assistance in the rescue of an abused child comes to represent the possibility of a transfigured nation. Because romantic love has been at the emotional core of Narayan's resistance to intolerance and oppression, the Shakespearean references in Water help explicate his involvement in political liberation. By employing a less tragic variation of Romeo and Juliet as her dramatic structure, Mehta fuses romantic loss with a historical narrative of India's journey towards political fulfillment. But at the conclusion of her film, Deepa Mehta supplements the narrative frames with an on-screen text that specifies an ongoing politics of protest. Quote, "There are over 34 million widows in India. Many continue to live in conditions of social, economic, and cultural deprivation as prescribed 2,000 years ago by the sacred texts of Manu." Martha Alter Chen, in her study Perpetual Mourning, Widowhood in Rural India, provides a sociological context in which a young girl character in Water, Chuya, is violated. The large number of very young widows in India, some 30,000 widows below 15 years of age, is particularly striking. One reason for this is that so few widows of any age remarry. Another is that so many women are married when very young. Even now, 2000, in some communities in India, girls are married before they reach puberty. As a result, there are child widows, including so-called virgin widows whose marriages had not been consummated before their husband died. Mehta, who did her degree in Hindu philosophy at Delhi University, argues that the harsh treatment of widows in India is a misrepresentation of Hinduism to benefit a patriarchal society. Fiercely oppositional to the reformist political perspective of her film is a traditionalist view among some in India, that breaking up the sets of Water was far too mild an act. The people involved with the film should have been beaten black and blue. The West refuses to acknowledge our achievements in any sphere, but is only interested in our snake charmers and child brides, and people like Deepa Mehta pander to them. Girish Kasuravalli's film, In the Shadow of the Dog, 2007, replies in more temperate terms to Mehta's depiction of the hardships experienced by widows in India. In his movie, that came out 2 years after Water, a widow ashram, quote, and this is from the Vancouver International Film Festival guide, is given very different treatment by one of South India's greatest directors. In the lovely atmosphere of an isolated old house in the forest surrounded by dappled sunlight and birdsong, we are treated to a classically paced, intimate drama. Delicate music and subtle camera movements flow through the old wood, oiled brass, and beautiful antique saris of this otherworldly yet ordinary place. But perhaps the most credible voice in this political debate belongs to Margaret Chen, who was encouraged in her research on widows in India by Amartya Sen, the 1998 Nobel Prize winner for economics. She interviewed over 550 women whose lives have been shaken, sometimes irreparably, by one common event, the death of a husband. Chen concludes that India is the one country in the world where the burning of the widow on the husband's pyre, sati, is still practiced. While there is the occasional public outcry when the treatment of widows takes a sensational form, such as that of sati, there is a striking lack of public concern for the quiet deprivations experienced by millions of widows on a daily basis. Deepa Mehta dramatizes their plight primarily through the storyline of thwarted love. As in Romeo and Juliet, romance threatens the sociological status quo. Almost every character in Water sees the marriage that Narayan and Kalyani intend as transgressive of caste and religious traditions. Ironically, as Margaret Chen writes, there is a common belief that widow remarriage is prohibited in Hindu society, but there is evidence to suggest that remarriage was once an orthodox Hindu practice which Brahmins abandoned later. Probably now only one out of every 5 or 6 widows remarries. When Narayan tells his mother about his wedding plans, she gasps in shock. Gandhi has turned you into a lunatic. Marry a widow? How can you even think of it? This is a sin. Her reaction is echoed in the next scene by the head of the widow ashram who tells Kalyani, "Have you gone mad? Nobody marries a widow." In 21st century India, such affronted, uncomprehending, and intensely hostile responses are directed even at the signifiers of romance. In 2003, members of the Shiv Sena would attack card shops selling valentines, burning red paper hearts and intimidating store owners until they pulled their stock from the shelves. The Associated Press would report the leader of the Shiv Sena's words at the time, quote, "Valentine's Day is against the ethics and culture of Indian society," unquote. It should be noted, though, that Mehta, in her film, also references an Indian tradition of romantic love that in Water localizes her adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. Kalyani, emotionally transported by her first encounter with a handsome Narayan, asked, "Does Lord Krishna take on human form?" Goliabi answers, "Of course he does. Haven't you seen us, Hajiras, reenact his life story? He plays himself while I play his adoring milkmaid." Later, Narayan quotes to Kalyani from an Indian poem, Meghdut by Kalidas, quote, "about the pain of separation between two lovers," unquote. In a boldly imaginative move, Mehta aligns romance with radical politics by citing the words of both Shakespeare and Gandhi in Water. Though seemingly antithetical in standing respectively for West and East, in her film, these two cultural icons articulate jointly the transformative power of love. Quote, "He says widows are strangers to love, and nobody should be a stranger to love." Gandhi. The speaker here, who's quoting this, half in gossip, half in wonderment, is Gulabi, who is an outcast like the widows. He is a maximally ambiguous creature on the outskirts of Eros, likely born a hermaphrodite, and now one of the Hijiras, eunuchs, who live their lives dressed as women, but who don't act like women. Gulabi is a social victim, but as a pimp, he is also a victimizer of Kalyani and later the girl Chuya. Yet in quoting Gandhi, Gulabi voices a half-repressed wish for love in a life of social degradation and self-loathing, one which refracts, quote, the struggle between tradition and individual expression that Mehta believes takes place in every culture, unquote, in Varanasi or Verona. As with Romeo and Juliet, the intolerance of tradition for the disturbance of love underlies the tragic shape of water. Quote, when you fall in love, you abandon the forms of ordinary life, Anne Carson suggests. Falling in love, it seems, dislocates your view of what is significant. Aberrant behavior ensues. Rules of decorum go by the wayside. The impending marriage of Kalyani and Narayan is socially categorized, as we've seen, as crazy. The abrupt setting aside of inherited rules and roles by both pairs of lovers, Romeo and Juliet and Kalyani and Narayan, creates dissonance within their cultures and stems from a prior reconfiguration of personal identity. As Anne Carson observes, a sensation of serious truth accompanies the lover's vision of himself or herself. There is something uniquely convincing about the perceptions that occur to you when you are in love. They seem truer than other perceptions and more truly your own. One from reality at personal cost. Greatest certainty is felt about the beloved as necessary complement to you. Your powers of imagination connive at this vision, calling up possibilities from beyond the actual. All at once, a self never known before, which now strikes you as a true one, is coming into focus. Romeo says to Juliet, I take thee at thy word, call me but love, and I will be new baptized. This newly emergent being, alchemized by love, renames the self, has no loyalty to the past, and asocially determines what is desirable. As Stephen Greenblatt writes, the exclusiveness and intensity of Romeo and Juliet's love is clearly in tension with the bond that links Romeo to his male friends. Now art thou sociable, says Mercutio, with evident relief, when Romeo briefly resumes the old mocking repartee. Now art thou Romeo. But neither Romeo nor Juliet is any longer the same person, and the passionate love that divides Romeo from his friends sets both lovers still more decisively against the values of their powerful families. Juliet balks at the marriage to Count Paris that her parents have arranged. Narayan refuses to wed the bride his mother has picked out. This clash of generations is what makes Romeo and Juliet one of Shakespeare's most intricate timepieces. And I'm now going to read a quote from Griffiths. The play has two escapement mechanisms, disastrously out of sync with each other. The slow tenacity of ancient grudge between the households, at odds so long with one another, nobody asks anymore how long or what started it. The sudden haste surrounding Juliet, which he sometimes fears as too like the lightning which doth cease to be, ere one can say it lightens, and sometimes welcomes, as when Friar Lawrence promises to make short work of her wedding. Water, with its pair of equally determined young lovers, hurriedly seeking to confirm their sudden, unsanctioned love in marriage, also threatens the tenacity of tradition and shares with Shakespeare's play a tragic double time. The first explicit reference to Romeo and Juliet in Deepa Mehta's film Water emerges slowly in the context of some continuing banter between Narayan and his friend Rabindra. And to give you a feel of this multi-stranded, multi-protagonist film, for those of you who haven't seen it, I want to show you now a sequence of scenes. It will run approximately 20 minutes, and it will give us an opportunity to focus on things like the cinematography and music, but also on the elusive intertextual connections that Deepa Mehta, in her scripting of Water, makes between Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and her own love characters. In the excerpt that we're about to see, we begin with a night scene with Narayan here, the handsome Romeo figure, and his friend Rabindra in conversation. Then shift to a morning scene on the opposite side of the river, and the river is a crucial division place. That conversation will involve two widows, Shakuntala and the child Chuya. Then cuts to the interior of the ashram where a hungry widow is shown. Chuya asks where Kalyani, the Juliet figure, is, who as a prostitute funding the ashram is ironically not permitted to eat with the other widows within the ashram. This sets up a balcony scene that reprises that in Romeo and Juliet. Then we see the pious Shakuntala, who makes in the film a significant inward journey. There are about a quartet of characters here who go through significant transformations in the duration of the film. She is helping a priest and confessing she feels no closer to spiritual self-liberation. And we will later watch Chuya begging and bringing food as a treat to a hungry widow who we'd seen earlier. And the final scene, before I resume my talk, will show Kalyani ferried across the river and Narayan and Rabindra in conversation, referencing and in some ways reenacting bits of Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's play, but crucially for my argument, intermingling Romeo and Gandhi as parallel co-identical figures. I was tempted just to watch the film again, but I think I'm obligated to come back. So the pleasures of the music and cinematography obviously are serving a intricate, deeply felt story, and my comments will be back towards the links of these two sets of lovers, one in Varanasi, one in Verona. In the context of this continuing banter between Narayan and his friend Rabindra, we notice that Rabindra's ideas about love are much more cynical. After the lyrical shot of the small boat crossing a river at night, we have Rabindra telling us, there goes a whore to meet a client, perhaps my father. It is only later that the viewer will know with certainty that the beautiful woman glimpsed in the darkness is Kalyani. Narayan responds to his friend with political advice. Rabindra, you should get your father to join Gandhi. Declining to join the Congress Party himself, Rabindra states as, I like the English in their ways. And what poets they have. She walks like a beauty in the night. This, in fact, is a misquotation, one that Narayan quietly corrects. She walks like beauty in the night, with a very different reference. And this literary misquotation, corrected by Narayan, associates him in some ways with the advocacy not only of national independence, but with a romantic sensibility that is unafraid of Western cultural influence. He projects this aesthetic vision, she walks in beauty like the night, into a national future for India that promises fuller human expressiveness. If Gandhi can free India, then think how Byron would sound recited by a free man. Although Byron, like Shakespeare, is a literary voice of India's colonizers. In this exchange, the former functions as a mythic figure whose self-sacrifice in the liberation of Greece combines political idealism with an erotic persona, and in that respect is a model, perhaps. The poetic allusion and its anticipated recontextualization provide a kind of analog for Narayan's character, and of course foregrounds the film's thematic concerns with expressive freedom, and prepares for the politicized parallelism to Romeo and Juliet. Rabindra, you haven't become a nationalist, have you? Narayan, passive resistance, an intriguing concept. Rabindra, forget it, romantics make terrible nationalists. Narayan, as a pure and passionate hero, in effect will test that proposition in water. Instead of juxtaposing Kalyani and Gandhi as incommensurable ideals, Mehta has Narayan act upon a vision that encompasses both as linked, realizable images of eros and freedom. But when, as we've seen, Narayan knocks on the door at the widow ashram, hoping to talk to Kalyani, he is rebuked. Men are not allowed here. This denial of access, similar to Romeo's experience outside the Capulets' walled orchard, then shifts to a more obvious echo of the setting of Shakespeare's play. From a high balcony, Kalyani and Chuya twist a wet sheet that accidentally drips water on the downcast, departing Narayan below. Accompanied by joyous, extra-diegetic music, the eyes of the two lovers meet. His irritation changes to delight before Kalyani crouches and half hides behind the symbolic bars of the balcony railing. Narayan returns across the wide river that joins and divides, and Rabindra resumes his mockery of his friend's romanticism. Romeo, oh Romeo! But in a less witty way than Romeo's friend Mercutio does in Shakespeare's second act. Throwing a cloth over his head, Rabindra performs a playlet that parodies the role of Juliet, making the literary connection to Kalyani's balcony scene with Narayan explicit. With the showy gesture of an extended hand, Rabindra declaims, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" In Shakespeare's play, this lament by Juliet about her beloved's identity as a Montague, a traditional enemy of her family, expresses her temporary despair at the impossible distance demarcated by pre-existing social categories. In Water, where the Shakespearean quotation follows a question by Narayan about the presence of Gulabi in the household, his friend's answer, a procurer, poignantly and ironically undercuts Kalyani's dreams of romantic love. Yet even as she functions as a prostitute in unrealized physical proximity to her Romeo, with Mehta establishing a nearly impossible social distance between the would-be pair, their romantic imaginings will persist. As Anne Carson argues on the basis of Sappho's poetry, it is exactly such a threat of gap or incompleteness that sustains desire and desirability. They are tactics of the imagination, which sometimes turn upon enhancing the beloved, sometimes upon reconceiving the lover, but which are all aimed at defining one certain edge or difference, an edge between two images that cannot merge in a single focus because they do not derive from the same level of reality. One is actual, one is possible. To know both, keeping the difference visible, is a subterfuge called eros. In Water, such a double vision likewise sustains the ardor of Narayan and Kalyani. When Rabindra queries the motives for Narayan's reformist zeal, the hero's twin desires are paradoxically strengthened, emerging with even greater intensity. Rabindra, if you hadn't met that widow, you wouldn't be such a champion of their cause. Narayan, I don't even know how to see her again. This parrying, half-joking exchange with Shakespeare allusions reinforces Narayan's commitment, paradoxically, to India's independence. Gandhi will take the colonizer's place. Through the earlier references to Byron, Mehta establishes a protagonist whose imaginative acts of yearning stretch out towards an idealized future that fuses Kalyani with Gandhi. Countering Kalyani's flat, despairing statement, "That's how things are," Narayan optimistically switches tenses. "That's how things were. Times are changing. All the old traditions are dying out." His transfigurative vision is akin to the dynamic and imaginative delight of desire, described by Aristotle as, quote, "a reaching out, orexis, for the sweet, and the man who is reaching out for some delight, whether in the future as hope or in the past as memory, does so by means of an active imagination, fantasia." Hopeful with romantic imaginings, Kalyani is freed in her mind to become someone else. For her, as for the Greek poets, desire changes a lover. She feels the change happen, but has no ready categories to assess it. The change gives her a glimpse of a self she never knew before. Kalyani now possesses a double vision wherein sordid reality might metamorphose into a kind of innocence. She intimates this hope to Narayan via scriptural quotation that she offers as a veiled confession. "Learn to live like a lotus, untouched by the filthy water it grows in." Krishna said it in the Gita. Communicating through a sympathetic, naive go-between, Juliet's nurse, on one hand, Chuya in the film, the romantic pairs in both Romeo and Juliet and Water meet secretly in a sacred place. "Bid her devise some means to come to shrift this afternoon at Friar Lawrence's cell. I would like to meet you tonight at Karam Ghat at the Shiv temple." The religious setting emphasizes the fidelity of their passion, signifies the imaginative transcendence of their love, and implies a divine aspect to their erotic fulfillment. The male and female protagonists in both Romeo and Juliet and Water appear to find something disturbingly lucid and true in Aristophanes' image in Plato's Symposium of lovers as people cut in half. All desire is for a part of oneself gone missing, as Anne Carson phrases it. Kalyani and Narayan's relationship embodies the innocence of first love. As with Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Made as Water celebrates the exquisite, brief joy of youthful passion, and even the tragic ending stresses the poignancy of that brief beauty, not the bitter futility of love, as in Troilus and Cressida, or Shakespeare's other tragedy, Othello. Mehta achieves a psychological effect mostly in nonverbal ways, whereas Shakespeare, quoting Greenblatt, manages to make the story of his reckless star-crossed lovers immensely moving, resistant at once to corrosive irony and to moralizing disapproval, principally through his mastery of the power of language to make and unmake the world. The director of Water achieves a comparable effect through cinematography and music. Most crucially for her film medium, there's an aesthetic mastery of water images, from lustrous to somber. Her director of photography, Giles Newtigans, has composed elegant shots of early morning light arriving on the river, along with inky, nocturnal footage, helping to establish the gap between bright desire and dark reality. For the lovers who are outside of, yet ultimately subject to, the flow of riverine time, the soundtrack adds to the sense of an intimate, fragile, co-created space. Where dialogue might be expected, Deepa Mehta has consciously allowed songs to push the narrative forward. In letting her characters experience the songs, she trusts the audience to feel the pair's unverbalized emotions. Mehta explains that, quote, "a writer/director can be ruthless," unquote. And in the scene where Kalyani and Narayan get to know each other, she cut 4 pages from her scripted dialogue in order to create moments of silence, instilling in the audience a belief in the pair's abrupt intimacy. Unfortunately for Kalyani and for Juliet, romance and romanticism encounter the tenacity of hostile tradition. As Anaya Lumba writes, identity is both self-constructed and constructed for us. With no apparent social remedy and unable to sustain a denial of their visionary desires, both women characters kill themselves. In Juliet's words, "If all else fail, myself have power to die." However, in contrast to the mistakenly grieving Romeo, Narayan does not end his life, even though he too, upon Kalyani's death, strongly desires that other half which is now absent. Unlike Romeo, Narayan is able to refocus his erotic desire in a romantic commitment to the future of an independent India, personified by Gandhi. His father's scornful comment, "You're not a hero in an epic play ready to wage war for love," only intensifies his son's already passionate belief. Once again, for Narayan, mockery further motivates a desire for transformation. The shift of his yearning idealism from love to politics is psychologically minimal, given that the true concern of the romantic is with bittersweet incompleteness. Again, quoting Carson, "If we follow the trajectory of Eros, we consistently find it tracing out the same route. It moves out from the lover toward the beloved, then ricochets back to the lover himself and the hole in him, unnoticed before. Who is the real subject of most love poems? Not the beloved, it is that hole." For Narayan, the flow of transposed Eros is unslackened because his romantic politics, centering on the figure of Gandhi, is more emotive than ideological. As Deepa Mehta states, Gandhi's presence was such that he mesmerized a whole generation of people. He galvanized a whole nation into feeling self-respect and wanting to get rid of the yoke of colonialism. In Water, the impetus for political transformation begins in the shared act of romantic imagining by Narayan and Kalyani, and that transfiguration by erotic desire is, however minimally, causally linked to the transfiguration of India. For artistic and ideological reasons, Mehta freely rewrites and resituates Romeo and Juliet within a fairly long tradition of Shakespearean reworkings in India. Her bittersweet reimagining of the play in Water is partial in both senses of the word, and her retelling reconfigures India's history of adaptation in interesting ways. Shakespeare, at least originally, quote, served as an icon of British cultural superiority in India. Jyotsna Singh, elaborating on this viewpoint, writes, "In recognizing with Said and others that colonial domination was and is as much a cultural as a political process, one can understand how the reproduction of the English play, both as a dramatic and literary text in theaters and educational institutions in 18th and 19th century Calcutta, was crucial in producing a discourse of cultural colonialism, a discourse in which Shakespeare was undoubtedly a privileged signifier. In the context of empire, India was faced with what Albert Memmi calls the most serious blow suffered by the colonized, being removed from political and cultural history. But instead, Shakespearean production in India became the means for rendering imperialist discourse problematic and dubious. A few striking examples of this subversion include the presence of an Indian actor, Vaishnav Charan Adya, playing Othello in Calcutta in 1848, disrupting the rigid categories of difference through simultaneous mimicry and resistance, and a pamphlet protesting the banning of the Communist Party of India that accompanied the program of Romeo and Juliet in March of 1948. Bharatendu Harishchandra, 1880 to 1885, one of the leading figures of Hindi theater, staged translations and adaptations of Shakespeare's plays, employing Shakespearean themes for expressing nationalistic ideas. The use of Shakespeare to authorize imperial power, then, at the same time, gave opportunities for disruption and displacement. Consequently, the iconic texts of the British Empire came to stand for both hegemony and, in a complex irony, resistance. The film Shakespeare Walla dramatizes with some pathos the displacement of British cultural authority in India. Walla is a Hindi word meaning peddler, and the director, James Ivory, presents a humble and rather grubby world of Lizzie and her parents, leaders of a troupe of British Shakespearean actors touring India, playing to ever-dwindling audiences, no longer able to peddle Shakespeare successfully. However, it has been asserted that more than mere vestiges of the colonial past that Shakespeare signified remain in a construction of power in India. By contextualizing her discussion of Renaissance tragedy within a critique of post-colonial English studies in India, Anaya Lumba, in her book Gender, Race, Renaissance Drama, pointedly reveals how the universal humanism put forward by institutionalized literary studies was useful and continues to be useful in the task of hegemonizing native elite culture. Thus, a continuing institutional reverence for the universal English book, the critic suggests, occludes the fact that an Indian not coming from an English-speaking background is, quote, in a position of disability, exclusion, and awe. On balance, it might be argued that two overlapping historical phases, empire and its subversion, largely define the continuing presence of Shakespeare in India. Yet, in Water, Mehta creates an alternative vision, an East-West hybrid, which affirmatively mingles speeches from Shakespeare's play with words spoken by Gandhi, such as these. The pursuit of truth is valuable for me. I trust it will be the same for you, unquote. Against the dialectic of self-fortification and self-confirmation by which culture achieves its hegemony based on a constantly practiced differentiation of itself from what it believes to be not itself, Mehta's art is one of hybridity. Like the anthropologist James Clifford, she implicitly argues for, quote, not the construction of simplifying essences and distancing dichotomies, but for lives that must always be mixed, relational, and inventive. From within the Bakhtinian notion of dialogism, Mehta's borrowings from Romeo and Juliet are in keeping with recent works in adaptation studies, evidence of a belief that the literary text is open and can be endlessly reworked. In the context of post-colonial theory, Shakespeare, often typecast as a figurehead of empire, has in Water multiple roles. Through ironic quotation, he becomes a target of mockery, with derision pointing to the role of parody as a tactic of resistance to imperialism. But in Mehta's film, Shakespeare also projects a possible third moment, one that might awkwardly be labeled post-colonialism. By polemically affirming the romantic expressiveness of Romeo and Juliet, Water disturbs the familiar dichotomies of post-colonial discourse. Because her film is set in a colonial past and carries along with it the viewer's knowledge that independence has been achieved long ago, and because the principal dramatic focus of Mehta's movie is on the plight of widows, Water becomes, by inference, a critique of the continuance of social oppression in present-day India. In seeming contradiction to Homi K. Bhabhi, who asserts the process of cultural hybridity, quote, estranges any immediate access to an originary identity or received tradition, unquote, Mehta, in the historical mirror that is her film, implies the incompletion of the promise of freedom and independence is due to indigenous traditions and practices that still shadow and constrain contemporary India. By triangulating a vision of a more equitable society, Water reaches out from the actual present of filmmaking via the depiction of the colonial past to posit a desired liberation for the future. The movie is itself an act of the romantic imagination. Like its protagonist, the film seeks transgressively to remake actuality. In its combination of narrative vision and protest, Water expresses a yearning for a reimagined India, psychologically validating and perhaps even foreshadowing a post-national space where individual lives, particularly those of women, might be uttered more freely. By reconfiguring the romanticism of Romeo and Juliet, Mehta repositions Shakespeare in India. He is no longer the arch-imperialist to be subverted, unless one takes the extreme view that the promotion of women's right is just another mode of westernization, an instrument of neo-colonialism. In Water, Shakespeare functions benignly as a fruitful source for dramatizing the imagination of love and the dialogical means of structuring a desired India that does not yet exist. In discussing her most recent film, Heaven on Earth, 2008, Mehta insists that every human wants dignity and emphasizes, quote, the use of imagination and whether or not it can break the cycle of violence. In stressing the importance of the imagination in creating a transfigured future, she sounds like Anne Carson paraphrasing Aristotle. Whenever any creature is moved to reach out for what it desires, that movement begins in an act of imagination. Without such acts, neither animals nor men would bestir themselves to reach out of the present condition. On a meta level, or is it a meta level, the director's persistence in completing Water, despite widespread resistance, hostility, the burning of sets, and death threats, almost reenacts her movie's plot lines, conflicts, and themes. The director's visionary commitment also invites comparison to the romantic intensity of Romeo and Juliet and to the political idealism of Gandhi. Despite evident risks of violence to herself, Deepa Mehta pursued the bittersweet erotics of an imagined possibility. The film resulted, again quoting Anne Carson, emits a light like knowledge. Thank you.